Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is Monday, November 2nd, 2020. We're going to go into tonight's an open forum. So, any question, any topic that you have, if you're a family or a friend, extended family or friend of an Evoke client, you're welcome to submit questions. You're welcome to submit questions about family and friends or for and on behalf of family and friends, maybe a young child that you have or a sister-in-law or a father is asking you a question and you're not quite sure how to respond or answer them, feel free to ask me that question for and on behalf of them, and I'll give you my answer. You can kind of incorporate it or compare it to the answer that you would give them. So this is really just open for anybody this evening that wants to speak, wants me to speak on a topic. I'll also take comments if you want to offer those at the same time. And we're going to go back first into pre-submitted questions that have been submitted either in the previous webinar or in between webinars, because we take questions at webinar@evoketherapy.com. So with all of that, let's get right into it. Please submit your questions at any time. I'm going to take them in the order that you submit them to my moderator, Malia, this evening. The first question, my question says, my daughter is being treated for an eating disorder, and the therapist does use family systems approach. I'm wondering if you know about or have an opinion about the Maudsley method. It sounds like family systems, but I'm not familiar with it. I'm not familiar with the Maudsley method either. I'm trained as a marriage and family therapist. I've worked at times with the population, eating disorder population. I've had several clients at Evoke with that issue, and I've worked as an adjunct staff at a program that specializes in eating disorder, but I'm not familiar with that. It's not my area of specialty that I practice every day, so that's my answer. I know it's kind of a simple yes or no answer. I'll Google it after we're done and see if I recognize it at all. So I'm sorry about that. Someone says, my child is doing artwork with wood in wilderness therapy, making rings and spoons. Briefly, how do they do that? Well, a couple of ways. They learn from a master. One of the staff is out there teaching them how to do that. We have a knife, a group knife, and we have carving tools that we supervise the clients and the students using. And so all of those are carefully monitored. And if one is lost or misplaced, the entire camp has to be searched. In fact, all of the gear has to be searched, because obviously some of those could be dangerous, could be used for self-harm or a weapon. So they're supervised and protected. If they're observed not following safety protocols, like not wearing a leather glove in the hand where they're carving, they're going to have the tools taken away from them, and probably taken away from them for some period of time. So it's basic behavior modification, but they also can call out sandpaper. And the more interested that clients get in the art, the more we're going to support them with it. So sometimes groups get really into using and making things out of leather and using leather tools. Sometimes they get really into carving. Sometimes staff can carve actually chain links, meaning that they're taking a stick and they're creating eventually links that are interlinked, like a chain would be interlinked. There's no break and then reattaching. It's just the way that they carve the wood. And so, part of that is to give them some artistic expression, to show them how, even in the most simple ways, they can do something that's enjoyable. They can get better at all the lessons that you would have them learn at home. So that's the basic answer about how they do that. And the ones that get into it more are going to want to share it with you, give gifts. At the end, we bring out cooking oil. They can soak their end wood carving projects. They can soak them into cooking oil, and then that makes them resistant to absorbing other things. And then if they use them to eat outside, they have to boil them in between use, so that we're making sure that they're sterile. So some people get really into it. When I go out there, if somebody has those crafts, I'll often take pictures of them, because I'm always so impressed, because that is not my talent. My spoons always look the same out there, and I just don't like the look of them. I can't quite seem to get them to look the way that some students and many of our staff can get them to look like it's something you would buy in a craft store or a kitchen store. So it's pretty impressive sometimes. Someone says, our son is currently at Evoke and will be moving on to an aftercare soon. In the previous webinar, you recommend a book which discussed setting boundaries. I cannot find the title in my notes. Can you remind me of the title of that book? My favorite book, which is probably the one that you're referring to, my favorite book on boundaries is The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner. Harriet Lerner has also become a friend of mine, and we've interviewed her on the podcast. So I think very, very highly of Harriet and her work. And the first work that I was introduced to, in fact, I think I saw this on shelves many, many years ago, but about 10 years ago, one of our therapists encouraged me to do a webinar on the dance of anger. And I think the subtitle is A Woman's Guide to Healing and Intimacy, something like that, or intimate relationships. I'm not sure. Malia can look that up. But when I read it for the first time, I thought it was going to be about anger, and I thought it was going to be for women. And the fact of the matter is, in fact, I talked to Harry about that in one of the interviews that I did with her that's on the podcast here. I talked to her about how the title doesn't quite fit. And what she said to me was, she said, well, women have for a long time had to square for themselves things that were always labeled predominantly as man or mankind or masculine in masculine ways. So I think men can learn to adjust for a little while too, which I thought was a pretty clever and funny and a good answer. But The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner, disregard the title. My two favorite books to recommend, just my two favorite self-help books, are The Dance of Anger and The Drama of the Gifted Child. And both of them, the title is not very illuminating or instructive. You end up in a much different place than you start. So if you think you don't have an answer, a problem with anger, don't worry about it. The Dance of Anger is virtually has nothing to do with anger. I mean, it has to do with the fact that if we don't set boundaries, we end up resentful, and that most of us stay resentful and try to manipulate, change, lecture with people in our lives so that we don't have to set boundaries. But for me, the core is really about boundaries. So that's the anger, or excuse me, that's the answer of it. A Woman's Guide to Changing Patterns of Intimate Relationships is the subtitle, but I think it's for everybody. Somebody says, can you address helping a parent identify when doubts about their kid's behavior, for example, lying to us, are objectively justified, or when it is our baggage? Young adult child is home after Evoke and aftercare. Whew, that's a doozy. Thank you for posting. Malia's doing a great job of posting you folks the things that I'm sharing with you, the drama, the gifted child she just posted. But back to the question. I was talking to my wife about this recently. We're both therapists, and I was talking about, as I train therapists, part of what I'm trying to train them is to pay attention to what's important. And that's a very hard thing to teach somebody. When I'm doing a therapy interview, when I'm in therapy, when I'm running an intensive, what I'm really trying to do is notice and pay attention to the most important things, because there's a lot that's going on that isn't important. I have this quote that I created a while ago that said, when your children are lying to you, try and listen to them as if they're telling you about a dream, because if we listen closely enough, we can hear the truth in the lie. We can hear what they're trying to express, what is going on for them. So you learn. This is my answer. I'm not apologizing for it, but it's not a simple, straightforward answer. And this is really the answer to virtually all of my questions. It's this: you learn to see and understand people the more you see and understand yourself. In other words, and I'm pointing, for those of you that are listening to the podcast, I'm pointing to my right temple right now. Once you understand the landscape inside of you, inside of here, that becomes the template to understand all the landscape with all the people that you meet, including your children. So your question has in it the answer, which is you do your work. When I meet with somebody, I can hear and understand them because I hear and understand myself, right? I can see somebody's insecurity because I, to some extent, have made friends with my insecurity. One of my three pathways to enlightenment in my book that I talk about in the last chapter is to remain on to get to know your own darkness and remain on speaking terms with your mental illness. And so what I mean by that is understand you, understand you're crazy, understand your triggers, and then that will be a guide to help you understand your child. So there's no simple, straightforward answer, template, or skill. It is my ability, Brad Reedy's ability, to understand other people is completely contingent on the work that I've done, on the exploration and the journey that I've traveled. And then I can understand you. I believe I use this quote in The Audacity to Be You. I'm referencing the knight in rusty armor. And the knight is going on this metaphorical journey to get rid of this armor. And he gets rid of it as he learns to feel, which is represented by the tears that rust off his armor. That's the metaphor aside. At one point during a moment of stress, he calls out for Merlin, who was helping him on his journey and who told him, anytime you need me, you can call out for me and I'll be there. And Merlin shows up and begins to answer the knight's question. And the knight says, I didn't tell you my question. How do you read minds? How do you know? And Merlin chuckled and said, no, I don't read minds, but because I know me, I know you. So that's my answer. I know when somebody looks afraid in a certain situation, I have a good guess at what they're afraid of because I've explored my fears in the same kinds of situations. And I'm not black. I'm not a woman. I'm not Asian. I'm not Hispanic. I'm not gay. I'm not transgender, right? I could go down the list of all the things that I'm not. I'm a white male. I could go down the list, cisgender, heterosexual male. I could go down all the things that I'm not. And you would say, well, how can you connect to a gay person? How can you connect to a person of color? How can you connect to somebody, to a woman? And it's because I've found the ways that I feel and think the same. I'll never know what it's like to walk into a crowd with black skin, to an all-white crowd. I'll never know what it's like to give birth to a child. Those are specific things that I will never know and have experienced. But I know what it feels like to be scared. I know what it feels like to not fit in. I know what it feels like to be afraid to show my authentic self, my real self, my true feelings at the risk of being rejected. I know what it's like to feel less than. I could go down the list of things. And in fact, I learned this lesson for me, and I'm not trying to prop myself up on a pedestal, just the opposite. But I was sent to therapy when I was young. I was getting in trouble, and I had the privilege and the gift of my parents sending me to therapy. So I remember sitting in my school counselor's office when I was 9 or 10 years old. And I remember sharing a feeling with him. And I remember him saying to me, I know how you feel. And I was crying and I was angry. And I said, you don't know how I feel. You didn't wake up in my bed today, with your mother yelling at you, right? With your father not at home. And I went down and I listed the specific circumstances in my life that day. And I said, don't tell me how you feel. And he said to me, I remember this discussion vividly. I could tell you where I was. He said to me, you're right, I don't know. But I know what it feels like to feel sad. And I remember thinking, I can't argue with that. Every once in a while, my therapist, who's a transgender 80-year-old woman, if you want to look at her broadcast also or listen to it, you can go to our archives. Jamie Gill is her name, and I quote her all the time in one of her 20 or so books. Every once in a while when I'm sharing my own dilemma as a white male, cisgender, heterosexual male, when I'm sharing my story about my fear about being rejected, being alone, not being accepted, struggling to find my voice, my truth, every once in a while she'll, with a loving smirk on her face, she'll say to me, I know how it feels to be afraid to be who you are. And then she'll say, with a glimmer in her eye, she'll say, don't ask me how I know this. And of course, I look at her and I say, of course you do. Of course you know what it's like. to feel those feelings. So I can't implore you more. I mean, that's why I want you all to hear the invitation to do your work. It's not because you're at fault or you're to blame. It's a gift. You know, I got in a lot of trouble. I was in several years in school. I was kicked out. I eventually dropped out of high school. I was arrested. I was living at friends. All kinds of problems going up. But all throughout, I've gone back to therapy, and you know, sitting in a room with an empathic patient other, a non-judgmental patient other, has given me the room to explore myself, explore the parts of me that were wrong or bad, or that I was told were wrong or bad. You know, the subtitle of my new book, Learning to Love Your Horrible, Rotten Self, that's the journey. And once you learn to make friends with yourself and whatever particular bent or mental illness you carry, and I don't mean it literally that you qualify for a mental illness, although some of you might. You know, anxiety is a mental illness. Um, but we're not really, we don't care about that line that delineates. Just get to know your stuff. Get to know your anxiety, your fear, your triggers, your traumas. And your traumas might not be as serious as the person's traumas that are sitting next to you. But you know, if I needed to have every trauma that my clients have, I would have a very narrow caseload. And if my life needed to be as bad as everybody's for me to have empathy, then I would again have a very, very narrow caseload. But after a while, I think one of the, for me, what I've learned in this process, not just in my own journey, although I have learned it there, but by watching children, young adults and adolescent children in the wilderness in groups, what I've learned by watching them over decades is the more work they do, the more they see the commonalities between themselves and others, right? I can't tell you how many times I've had a young man or a young woman sitting in a circle next to somebody who has a dramatically different story than they do and say to that person, you know, I didn't steal my grandmother's medications because I was addicted. I didn't do that. But lying was my drug, or anger was my drug, or sex was my drug, or avoidance was my drug. And let me tell you what I did that reminds me of what you did. And I think conversely, a sign of a lack of mental health is to see people as other, right? To see them as a different animal, if you will. Othering, I talk about othering in the context of the kind of racial divide that we see in our culture these days. And the more work you do, the more you realize that you're just like everybody else in more ways than not. And the less work you do, the more different you see other people, right? You are incredulous at how somebody else could do or say or feel or believe what they feel. And that incredulousness is a lack of awareness of your own humanity. We all have it sometimes, but that's what it is. So hope I answered the question. Next question. How can I best encourage my daughter who feels like a failure because she has returned to wilderness third time after being kicked out of her step-down therapeutic boarding school? Who was I talking to recently? I was just talking to somebody. I think it was my son. I have a son, an 18-year-old son, who identifies as non-binary. He calls himself transgender, but identifies really as non-binary. And, you know, he came out in high school. He goes to a private high school in the Salt Lake City area. And he was the first transgender student that they had had. And we supported him, and we told all of his teachers, and they changed his name on the rolls, and they changed his pronouns and everything. And now he's in college in New York. And yeah, I was thinking about this the other day. Like, I think I made a lot of mistakes as a dad, but one of the things that I did do is I talked about we've talked about our mental health issues as parents openly and without shame. And so it removes the quality that has to be present in judgment. And I think one of the gifts that we gave to my son, and we did enough to dent him also, believe me, but one of the gifts that we gave him is there's no shame in being human, right? Or there's I should say there's less shame in being human because we haven't totally eradicated shame from ourselves, of course, of course. But I think it's a cultural thing. And I think the culture can start in the family. And so, I don't know that you can remove it from her. I would, when any child feels anything, this is important and more central to all of you. When any child feels anything, what I want to encourage first is curiosity. Tell me more. I want to understand. That makes sense. Thanks for telling me. I'm glad you're talking about it, right? That's what it looks like to hold space for people, psychologically speaking, in a way to allow them to be who they are, to help them to heal. So the first thing I would say to you is get curious, ask questions, learn. And slowly, not with telling her not to feel it or trying to talk her out of it or trying to give her a pep talk. None of that will work because that will dismiss her feelings. But validate them first. And then secondly, over time, talk about your stuff, your failures. Let me use a very simple example that I think every parent can relate to. Almost every parent I've ever worked with in my life, maybe that's an exaggeration, but most parents that I've worked with are concerned to some extent about their child's susceptibility to peer pressure. And they're inclined to at times give their child a mini lecture on peer pressure, saying things like, don't worry about what anybody thinks about you, or what other people think about you is not your concern, or self-esteem is an inside job. You have to feel good about yourself. Those kind of trite little ideas that we offer to our children that come from a place of wanting the child to feel better. I understand it. But what I have learned, and this example becomes kind of a symbol for what I'm teaching right now, is talk about your peer pressure. Talk about your fear of judgment. Talk about your anxiety about what the neighbors and the relatives think. If you were to tell your complete truth, or even how they feel about you as a mother or a father. If you have a child in treatment, what does that mean? I mean, in other words, you're still struggling with the thing that they're struggling with. And so don't give them an answer because you know how hard it is, right? We all know how hard it is to be exposed. And then what you'll find is remarkable is a decent percentage of the time, your child will give you the lecture you were about to give them about peer pressure. See, intellectually, we know it. But emotionally, it's evidence of a wound from our childhood, from not being seen, from not being okay just as we are, from being taught that there was some kind of importance about making your parents feel proud, or your teachers be proud of you or happy with you, or whatever. So just talk about your own struggle. And that will lift them out of theirs in a strange way. Someone says, what do you mean when you say to find your truth as a parent? Could you explain an example? I mean, your truth is just a psychobabble word, phrase, way of saying what you think, feel, want, believe, right? It really is anything after I. I believe, I think, I want, I hope, I like, I dislike, I hate, I can't stand, I prefer, I'm indifferent. So it's anything you want, believe. Your truth is just what you feel, think, believe, and want, do, right? It's just you. And so when people like me say your truth, it's probably unnecessary psychobabble. It makes sense once you understand what it means, it encompasses, because it encompasses all of those things, and it's the one word that we can use to capture all of those things in one phrase or one sentence. But it's really just about being who you are, finding out what you want, and it involves things like, what's my trauma? What's my history? What are the messages that I carry around? What's my inner voice telling me? So it's just who you are. That's why we use that word to encompass all those things, but it's nothing really more magical than that. Someone says, my daughter is a transracial adoptee, abandonment by birth parents, Abandonment by birth parents is a huge loss and a wound she will carry forever. Hence, she's in wilderness therapy. The child should never be expected to feel grateful. And I hate when people tell me she is so lucky. I tell them I am lucky. Yeah. Um, Drives me crazy, actually. Um, I think that in fact, Judith, you might have Judith as your therapist, I would guess, but because she specializes in transracial adoption. Um, isn't it a strange instinct to tell people how they should feel? Isn't that an odd thing to tell somebody how they must feel or should feel? We Judith was teaching an in-service to our staff a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about transracial adoption, and she was describing this one issue about children of color, black children specifically, who are adopted by white parents, get told all the time, like, you're so lucky, and what a blessing. And it's not that simple for the child. And after Judith gave a presentation kind of pointing out what you just did, I said, but guys, this applies to everybody. It applies to children that are not transracial, that are just adoptees. It applies to children that aren't adopted. To say to somebody, you should feel, doesn't matter what the next words are, is nonsense. It's craziness. And yes, it's most obvious in a situation like the one that you're describing, but universally, it's a crazy idea that human beings have an instinct. It's a crazy instinct to say to somebody, you must feel X, Y, or Z, because they feel whatever they feel. And once we do a little bit more work and we explore the complexities of our own feelings, we would never have the instinct to imagine that somebody feels the way we imagine they should feel, and that they feel one thing only, right? Because your child, as you know, can feel both grateful and love you, and also curious and sad for the loss, right? And feel sad for not being in a family where everybody has the same skin color, because that leaves them in kind of no woman's land, if you will, where they're not white enough and they're not black enough, and on all of those stories, right? So, yeah, it's a strange dilemma, strange instinct. I'm sorry, strange instinct. When you talk about parents, somebody says, when you talk about parents not being their child's friend, my mother used to tell us that she is our mother and our friend, but not our pal. I love that. In order to show us that we need to respect her boundaries, but she's always there for us. Like I said last week when I was talking about this, I love the flavor with the word pal. I wrote a blog about this last year, I think, or maybe the year before, about why you should be your child's friend. And I'm making a point by saying that I think that I don't think we understand what it means to be a healthy friend sometimes, because a healthy friend has boundaries and limits and says no, and doesn't allow somebody to treat them in such a way to violate their boundaries, and requires accountability in the relationship. As I start describing that, everybody will say, well, that's what a parent would do ideally also. So there probably are more things, and I just go back to the simple quote by I think it's Rudolf Dreikers, the famous child psychologist, who said that the proper way to treat a child is the proper way to treat another human being. What I've learned in my work is that there's more in common. I have more in common in terms of how I think about my friends, my spouse, my children, my clients, my colleagues, right? There's more in common in those relationships than there are differences. And by the way, the areas that I stumble in all of those relationships have the same theme. And of course, I have a different relationship with my wife than I do with my children, right? There are boundaries that are different with each. That's easy to point out. But at the deeper layers, right? The deeper levels, there are more things that are alike than there are different. Malia, you're doing a great job tonight. Malia just shared the blog that I wrote on why you should be your child's friend. Thank you so much. Someone asked, how can I and the rest of our family help support our son given his new bipolar diagnosis? We are doing our work through individual therapy, family therapy, and support groups. These have all been very helpful in our changing our perspective and improving our family dynamic. You did a podcast on mood disorders back in 2017. It was very helpful. And I was wondering if you've developed any further thoughts on particularly bipolar disorder. I don't know if I have or not. I'd have to go back and listen. Bipolar is a tricky one because when you're manic, it feels great. I probably said this back then. And when you're depressed, it feels horrible. And so getting people, first of all, to take medications, because medication is indicated for bipolar disorder, it's hard because they want to go off of them when they feel good. They also, especially if they have a tendency to be in mania, it blunts it, right? It takes the peaks off, and the peaks feel kind of exceptional. It's like being on cocaine, right? Being manic is like being on cocaine, and being on cocaine feels wonderful. That's why people get addicted and die from it and steal for it and commit crimes for it. So medication is important. Kind of finding your center so you're not kind of pushed and pulled. It's very easy with somebody with a very volatile mood disorder like bipolar or borderline personality disorder, which is not a mood disorder but another disorder. With many disorders that where dysregulation is common, where extreme behavior is common, where button pushing is common, you're going to have to focus more on staying grounded and staying you, right? You're going to have to find anchors and anchor yourself more because they're going to more easily throw you off your center, your game, who you are. So that's a part of it. There was something else I was going to say, which is discover what your diagnosis is, And although, again, like I said earlier in this broadcast, you may not qualify for the threshold of being diagnosable, right? And if you are, if you, whoever I'm talking to, are one of those people that you don't cross any of the thresholds for being, for having a mental illness or mental health disorder, then congratulations, good for you. But find your themes, right? You might not have an anxiety disorder, but you probably struggle with anxiety. You might not be depressed, but you might be prone toward feelings of sad or blue or helplessness. You might not be a narcissist, but you might have tendencies toward narcissism. And I could go on and on and on through all the disorders. And so find and focus what make that the project. That's all that people want. People that are close to you want is they just don't want to be your project. If your child is in our program or in another program, or if you have a loved one or a spouse in treatment or identifies as an alcoholic or a sex addict or whatever it is, okay. But don't make that your project. Make you your project. It's such a burden off of their shoulders. Such a burden off of their shoulders. So take care of yourself, focus on yourself, stay grounded, find an anchor yourself. Focus on boundaries, focus on not changing them. And you support them by modeling this. You support them by owning your own stuff. You support them by making your life your project. By taking care of yourself. Ram Dass, the famous writer and guru, said, I can do nothing for you but work on myself. And you can do nothing for me but work on yourself. Did I say that twice? I can do nothing for you but work on myself. You can do nothing for me but work on yourself. At the end of the day, if you'll allow me some kind of oversimplification, that's what it's all about. Somebody writes this: living your truth and having the courage to live authentically feels like a huge risk. It could mean even giving up friends, family, and maybe even your marriage. What if you don't have a partner that does their work? It makes it very hard to find the courage to share your truth and have faith that they will accept you in this newfound way. What you describe feels like a privilege that not many people have. It's a great comment question. Here's what I found with this. You will lose people. And I have become a horrible predictor. I was working with a parent today, and we were talking about his young adult son. He's done a lot of work. They've been in programs before, and the father said to me, he said, I'm learning that I'm a horrible prognosticator, predictor. So you're right, it's a huge risk. And you can end up losing people. You will lose people. And you'll gain people. And you don't know who they are. And some of your predictions will be spot on, and some people will surprise you in both directions. So as I started to, in my 40s, really lean into this idea of trying to be, making my project, being more of myself more of the time, my entire world shifted. It's part of why Evoke exists separate from the program that we used to be tied to. I mean, that's part of it. And it not only did it cost me emotionally in some friendships, it cost me money in some businesses, right? Like there are huge sacrifices. And no therapist, including me, can tell you what risks to take. I tell the story, and I won't get into the story in depth, but at one point in my early 40s, I set boundaries with both of my parents. My parents are divorced. And I set boundaries for different reasons. The specifics were different, but as I was coming into this work that I'm describing, I set very clear boundaries with my parents, not in an angry way, but just in a matter of fact, resigned way. I said to them, this is what I will tolerate and this is what I won't. And my father and I never reconciled. And my mother went to therapy and came back 2 weeks later and said, I can be there for you in the way that you're asking. I'm okay with it. And I've learned and I understand now. So I made the two different discussions on 2 different days having to do with 2 different things. I mean, it's just an example where you tell the truth and you can't control for outcomes. My wife, at one point, as I started to tell her, the truth is I was learning it, right? I'm learning the truth. She learned to respond to it differently. I lost friends and I gained new ones, and that will happen, and it's hard. And in the interim, the bridge that you can kind of build to cross over to the other side, that's where therapists and support groups like Al-Anon are for, or Codependence Anonymous. Those groups that we recommend each week, Al-Anon and Codependence Anonymous and Families Anonymous and Adult Children of Alcoholics Anonymous, all of those groups and Refuge Recovery, all of those groups are places you can go for free. And during the pandemic, you can go to virtually, where you can find your people. And not everybody in every group is going to be your people, but you'll find people on this journey that I am describing. And I've said to my therapist, the longer I do this work, I have my same therapist for the past 21 years. You might know if you've listened to me at all. And I say to her, sometimes it's hard and it's lonely. And I feel wonderful in my session. And then by the time I get in my car and I'm 4 or 5 blocks away, it comes rushing back to me, the fear that comes with the reality that not everybody's going to be okay with who I am. So I don't know that anybody has all the privilege and the security. It's something you step into. Obviously, having a partner is a huge advantage. But again, I didn't know I had that partner the first 10 years of our marriage. I would have told you I didn't. In fact, at one point I would have told you that. And the only way I found out was by doing what I did. And you might lose. Anybody can be lost in this process. So all I will say to you is, I'm with you. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm with you. Someone says, how do you approach inner child work when you've had very few childhood memories? I've always been embarrassed that I can't remember much from childhood. But through my own work in therapy, I'm realizing this stems from being in an anxious and chaotic childhood. I have a theory about not remembering childhood. One theory. One of them is when somebody sees you, a parent or an adult sees you, it's like your life is being recorded. When you're not seen, it's like it doesn't get recorded anywhere. But when you get to be yourself, when that becomes the family culture, that the children get to be themselves, my theory is you remember more. So when you live in an anxious home where connection is limited, it makes sense that you wouldn't remember. But here's my experience, and here's what I teach. I don't think therapy and inner child work is about, for most people, most of the time, it's not about going back in time and remembering what happened to me in the third grade, what happened to me when my parents separated, what happened to me when we moved to Irvine, California. It's not that. For me, therapy is, I'll tell it to you this way. When I was first working with my therapist, she would say things about my parents. And I said to her, first of all, it didn't ring true all the time. Second of all, I would say, I don't know why you're saying that because I haven't talked about my parents that much. I told you enough stories for you to draw that conclusion, to come to that conclusion. So it doesn't make sense to me. It didn't really resonate, right? So I said that to her. 20 years later, everything she said was true, and it's obvious to me as can be. So I remembered after I did the work. When I read The Drama of the Gifted Child, I started to remember. Right? When I tell the story in my book about being in a New York studio radio show, being interviewed and being completely anxious and dysregulated and unclear. And then I processed that in therapy. That's when I remember what my childhood was like. So it's almost like I start to fill in the picture of the past based on discovering this here and now. And the exercise of inner child work is not to get it right, but just to imagine. Inner child work is the kind of inner child work that we do here in our intensive program, even with your children sometimes, is we say, imagine what it would be like to travel back in time to your 8-year-old self or whatever age you choose. What might you say? How would you feel? And if your reaction is, I don't even know you, I can't relate to you, I don't know what you're like, that's gold. That might be the most important thing you could discover. And part of what you're telling me is that's what it was like for you. Nobody saw you. Nobody understood. They didn't ask how you were doing. They were just making sure you got it right or stayed quiet or weren't a burden or whatever it was. And so you start to fill in that picture kind of from here backwards, not going back and remembering. So if you have that same experience as this person who's writing in and saying, I don't remember, that's okay. That's as important a part of the story as any. That tells us something about your childhood. Your lack of vivid memory of it tells us something about your childhood. And we're going to kind of find that out together as we work together. But it's not by simply going back and trying to remember. It's by talking about how it felt in the grocery store today when somebody stepped in front of you, right? Or when your child got kicked out of school, what that did for you. You explore the here and now, and that begins to inform, shed light on where you came from. Someone says, we are taught that we can't control our kids or their actions. I accept that, but aren't we controlling them by placing them in a wilderness or an RTC thereafter? Our child has made good mental health strides, but They're still, but still wants to smoke pot. Our boundaries are that we can't allow him to return to use our house to use at our house, or else he has to go back to a residential treatment center. I struggle with how we need to think about boundaries and controlling. Your thoughts are appreciated. You know, the ideas of boundaries and control and letting go are nuanced for parents, especially for parents, because you have to make decisions, right? It's your responsibility to make decisions in regards boundaries in regards to your children. So if you don't make them, you're making them, right? There's actually from the rock band Rush. You know, he says if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. Um, so it's a spiritual thing or psychological thing if you're not inclined to think of yourself as spiritual. It's letting go. It's you know, think about a sport. If you play a sport, um, I'll use something like tennis because even if you don't play tennis, you can imagine, or just throwing a ball. Okay, throwing a ball. If you get nervous and you try to aim it, you lose your power and effectiveness at getting the ball to go where you want it to go. I read a book or was given a book by my high school guidance counselor, Bob Venable. Still remember him. I saw him just a few years ago. I went back and spoke at my high school, the high school I dropped out of, and he was still the counselor there. And Bob gave me a book called The Inner Game of Tennis right before I dropped out. And it was about practicing, and then forgetting. Just trusting that you know. That's what control means. It's not that you don't set boundaries or you don't, you know, this morning I walked into my daughter's room. She does homeschool school on computer half the week, and half the week she does it in person. And I walked in and I said, "Get up, clean up your room, pick up the garbage." I flipped on the light and I walked out. Small interaction, right? Um, the she could fight me, she can resist me, she can do anything that she wants. She can do it. Um, I'm not going to get into a power struggle about it. I'm not going to eventually, you know, I'm not going to die on that hill. I'm not going to fight and try to control it. I'm going to be clear about my boundaries, be clear about my consequences. You know, if you do this or that, I'm going to choose this or that, which could be an RTC, and then you get to choose how you deal with it. You can be grateful for it. You can hate me for it. You can take advantage of it. You can be a victim to it. You get to do with it what you do. But I'm going to do what I do that I feel that I need to do for myself as a father, as a mother. So it's not inactivity. People that set boundaries and let go of control are more honest, courageous, and authentic. People that let go of control set better boundaries than people who don't. Permissive parents tend to be more controlling than strict parents. Not always the case. But permissive parents are often the most controlling because they're trying to emotionally coerce, tiptoe, walk on eggshells, manipulate, right? They're trying to get behavior and get outcomes. And so boundaries are risky because once you set a boundary, you lose the ability to control how the child reacts to the boundary. So it's a different way of thinking about it, and it's nuanced. And it doesn't mean passiveness. It just means detaching from how they respond to it. Someone says, "How can I help myself with my husband? I know he loves me, but he doesn't express it concretely." You know, it's a great question that's really, really, really hard to answer. In just a short answer, what I would say is figure out, find your love story, find your courtship story, find out what attracted you to each other, And in that story, you will find the answers to the questions that you seek. In other words, I can identify that my wife and I have certain patterns that are pretty cemented, right? We struggle with certain patterns. What I discovered in 2010, 11 was it wasn't an accident that I married her. In fact, part of the reason that we fell in love became part of our biggest problem. I was a fixer. I soothed her and made her anxiety go away. She thought that was wonderful. She called that love. And of course, I called her reaction love because then she loved me back and thought I was wonderful. And so that's all heaven, right? Sounds great. I listen, I contain, I support, I'm flexible. I can listen more than most. I can soothe her more than most. Not even traditional problem solving, just listening and soothing and empathizing. And that's part of our love story. Fast forward a few years, and I got tired of being responsible for her anxiety. Right? I lost my authenticity because I couldn't tell the truth and take care of myself first. Because if I took care of myself first and set a boundary with her, she would get upset and all hell would break loose. So I had to realize why I fell in love with an anxious person. And she had to figure out why she fell in love with the crazy person that I am. So when somebody tells me I married a narcissist or my ex-husband is a narcissist or my ex-wife is bipolar or pick the disorder, I always say that's interesting, but why would you fall in love with somebody who can't express affection toward you? There's an answer in there that's really, really important. See, I talk about this in the Audacity to Be You. Our wounds kind of fit together like a puzzle perfectly, and we call it love. And all it is that we our conditioning and our wounds and our dents and they all kind of fit together perfectly, and we call it love and a union. And then marriage, if it's to be one that grows and evolves, as you heal and as you become aware and wake up and want different things, they don't fit together anymore. And so what was once okay is now not okay. And figuring that out is important. And you get to decide. I think I've told the story several times where a therapist asks me, how much is too much to sacrifice and to give? Because obviously relationships require sacrifice and giving. But how much is too much? When do I turn into a doormat? Or when am I being too self-centered and selfish? And my answer to this question when I was asked it was, that's right. That's the right question. It's the question of finding you and finding yourself. And you're going to be at it for the rest of your life. And it's not a static answer. It might change over time, which is really, really hard. When my adult children ask me about marriage, about what they should look for in a partner, the few times that they consult me about it, I say it's really hard to describe any certain trait because you're going to be a different person in 10 and 20 years. And so for me, it's about finding somebody who's willing to learn and to grow, willing to change and to die over and over and over again. Metaphorically speaking, of course. All right, last question. My 16-year-old son was at Evoke this spring and is now in a mainstream boarding school that has supports, including substance use counseling. He seems to be doing well, but our relationship has always been fraught with, and communication is difficult. He recently had a scary but quickly resolved sports injury. Shortly after, he called me and said he had been hit in the head with a ball. It seemed mild, but I called the school nurse. He got very angry that I'd informed her and said, "That's why I never tell you anything. I'm really working on myself, and as you just talked about, the only way to understand him is to help him heal. But what do you suggest doing? The issue comes up a lot, and I'm guessing he just wasn't feeling safe in the moment." Say sorry. That's what you do. For me, learning to say you're sorry might be the most important thing that we ever do to our children. I talk about this idea that at the end of the day, no matter what the parenting technique or tool is, you're going to come up short. And then you get to say you're sorry. And then your child learns the most important lesson that you can teach them, which is that it's okay to be human. So just say you're sorry. Just in the journey of the heroic parent, I call it being an idiot parent. Just admit to your child that you're an idiot, and then they'll stop arguing with you. Just own it. And even if you didn't commit an objectively horrible sin, right? Just, I'm sorry. Sorry I did that. Don't talk about how you had good intentions, and don't justify it. That's just your defense. Just, I screwed up. I'm learning. Thanks for telling me. Your anger makes sense. I get why you wouldn't trust me. I mean, that's the irony, right? What we say to our children when they tell us that they don't trust us, we say is, thank you for telling me. I'm glad you're telling me. All right, folks. That's a fast hour for me. And if you want to do intensives, if you want to do deeper work, we have them online and in person. We have an online one coming up November 13th. If you the one in November is full, so December, we just opened up December. I strongly encourage it. The one online is shorter. It's 2.5 days. It's over a weekend, I believe. I think, but you don't have travel. It's less expensive than the ones that are in person, which are longer. So you kind of can pick and choose between the time and money resource that you have and what you get. I did not think that online intensives could be as good as they are, and they're amazing. So if you want to do a deep dive into this work, we have some openings in our online upcoming intensive in November 13th through 15th. For more information, contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. I strongly recommend it. I've done 9 myself. Believe in them wholeheartedly. 9 myself as a participant. We have pursuits trips, therapy trips that are adventure trip based for families or adults. Think sober fun. You can also do that in between programs. With the pandemic, there are a lot of limitations about program interaction. So an intensive pursuits program outside with your child can be an option. Our next parent support group for alumni parents of Wilderness program will be November 5th, 6:30 Mountain Time. And for alumni of our online support groups will be November 10th, 6 p.m. Contact Malia@evoketherapy.com for more information. We ask you, like I said, to go to 6 12-step support groups. We just ask you to try 6. Any 6. All these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Please share, rate us, give us feedback there, or you can go to soundcloud.com to get any of these also, to look them up there. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram. It's not just, it's inspirational stories, links, self-help, things like that. We're also on Facebook at Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. We have a foundation for people that can't afford therapy, evokefamilyfoundation.org if you want to give back there. We also have a blog. My 2 books, excuse me. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon. Any day now. I've been saying this for like 2 months, but any day now. The audio book version of The Audacity to Be You will be released, and you better believe that I'll announce that and make a big deal out of it. I'm the one who recorded it. And then our next webinar will be a week from I'm going to take the rest of this week off. So it'll be November 9th, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm going through my book, The Audacity to Be You, chapter by chapter. So the next chapter that I'll be talking about is Finding You, which also is the name of our intensive program, Finding You. In fact, this book came out of the intensive work, facilitating those intensives. So I'll be talking about Finding You on November 9th, November 16th, another Q&A, and then November 18th will be Finding Others. Thank you for joining me, folks. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. I hope you have a peaceful and safe week. Take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.